Hi, I'm Jessica Marshall from the Times-Union. Before we start this week's Eagle, a warning. This episode contains explicit language and descriptions of events that may be upsetting to listeners. Please listen with care. It was a long and emotional week in the capital region. Tensions once more ran high between civil rights protesters and police. On this episode of The Eagle, we're going to take you through what happened. The week we're talking about began with a peaceful protest in Albany's Townsend Park on Wednesday, April 14th. Dozens of Black Lives Matter supporters gathered for a rally. They were moved to do so by the news of the police-involved killings of Daunte Wright and Adam Toledo. At the same time, a tense nation awaited closing arguments in the trial of ex-Minneapolis cop Derek Chauvin on trial for the murder of George Floyd. Later that night, emotions ran hot. A small group of protesters clashed with police outside Albany PD's South Station. Police used pepper spray on several individuals. One protester was injured when a policeman pushed a megaphone she was holding. Protesters wrote on the station walls. One smashed the front window. Two days later, Albany Police Chief Eric Hawkins and Albany Mayor Kathy Sheehan held a press conference.
So the mayor and I are here this afternoon to discuss the riot that occurred this past Wednesday at the South Station. And I use that word intentionally because what we saw Wednesday evening was not a peaceful protest. It was a riot.
They showed videos of the incidents from various police cameras and angles. They argued the protesters instigated the clash.
The protesters were banging on the doors, trying to get in, breaking a window, all of that done by protesters, not by the police, by protesters, in a scene that was eerily familiar to us and reminded me of what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th.
The mayor's comments quickly drew ire from activists. She apologized the following day on Twitter, saying, quote, "My comments referred to the physical actions of the use of violence to attempt to gain unlawful entry into a government building. To be clear, the January 6th insurrection was fueled by white supremacy and was an assault on our democracy. In no way did I intend to compare the insurrection to the BLM movement or protests. I am sorry." Unquote. The next day was a Saturday. That morning, activists gathered under the Collar City Bridge in Troy for a rally commemorating the 5-year anniversary of the death of Edson Thevenin at the hands of Troy police. A few miles downriver, local Black Lives Matter leaders held a press conference. They demanded that the city fire the police officer who pushed the megaphone of a protester on Wednesday, causing her to fall and chip a tooth. They demanded a meeting with the mayor and the police chief. In the early evening, local activists organized a march. Several dozen people participated, carrying signs and chanting as they walked through the streets of Albany.
Adam Toledo! Adam Toledo! Adam Toledo!
They began at Townsend Park. They headed down Lark Street across the faded Black Lives Matter painted into the street. Then on down past the Capitol. They ended in front of South Station. That night, protesters set up camp outside of South Station. They erected tents, small aluminum fire pits. They bundled up to brace the incoming cold spring weather. They vowed not to leave until their demands were met. There were no interactions with police in the few days that followed. The following Tuesday, the jury trial of Derek Chauvin went into deliberation. Roughly 10 hours later, they announced they'd reached a verdict. Chauvin was convicted of murder and manslaughter in the 2020 death of George Floyd. Many in the capital region openly rejoiced at the conviction. The Times-Union sent reporters to South Station, as well as to gatherings in Schenectady and Saratoga Springs, to capture the reaction. Reporter Eduardo Medina headed to South Station, where about 36 were gathered.
So it was really tense before the verdict was announced. The protesters have been outside South Station for 4 consecutive days. In the morning, they could hear police boarding up the windows inside the building. Half an hour before the verdict was announced, the protesters were some of them were cleaning their goggles with rubbing alcohol. They were putting on vests. They were just really anxious. They were quiet. There wasn't really a lot of noise. There was just a lot of anxiety leading up to, what the verdict would be. And I think everyone was just kind of preparing for the worst.
As the judge approached the bench in Minnesota, the small crowd gathered around a speaker in the middle of the street to listen to the live stream.
People had their, chairs in a circle, and the speaker was in the middle, and they were all listening. And then once the judge started speaking, once his voice could be heard, everyone rose, and it was really quiet, and everyone began to hold hands.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m.
There seemed to be this release of tension and this sense of just enormous relief. These protesters did not want to again raise their voice in fury. They've been doing so, for 11 months, and especially this past week, they've been doing so ever since last Wednesday.
Reporter Rob Gavin was also on the scene in Albany.
Hi, this is Rob Gavin with the TU. I'm here with Lexis Figueroa. Lexis, how do you feel about the verdict? What's your reaction to this?
I feel a lot of things. I'm happy because hopefully this is a step forward in the system. Hopefully we'll finally start getting some kind of justice. I'm also a little weary about things. I don't want people to be too relaxed and be like, this is end all and like everything's okay. Dante Wright was just murdered less than a week and a half ago in Minneapolis. So we're just gonna keep on. We gotta make sure he gets justice as well.
Gavin, the Times-Union Cops and Courts reporter, took a deep dive into the conviction.
The charges that George Floyd's now convicted killer, Derek Chauvin, was facing included second-degree murder. Count 2 is murder in the third degree, which is, by the way, a charge we don't have in New York State. And the third count in the indictment was manslaughter in the second degree. What does that mean? In New York, second-degree murder, there's a couple of different varieties, but the max is all 25 to life. In Minnesota, it's a little bit different. The max is about 40 years. There are enhancements, which I understand there could be enhancements. They could try to make sure that he gets as much as possible. I think you'll see at least an attempt to have that be done.
After the verdict was read Tuesday night, reporter Paul Nelson went to a planned prayer vigil outside a church in Schenectady's Hamilton Hill.
It was just a very jubilant atmosphere. I mean, I can remember, as people were arriving, this kind of sticks out in my mind. There was a woman, and she came with some other people, and she was in the parking lot and just kind of glorifying the name of the Lord.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
A coalition of interfaith religious leaders in Schenectady organized the vigil at the Duryea Memorial AME Zion Church, a location chosen for its history. The church was founded in 1837 by abolitionist Reverend Isaac Duryea. It became the first African-American church in Schenectady, and today is the oldest in the Capital Region.
But I think it's important that we see the unity within our faith community.
Nelson spoke to church leader Reverend Nicole Harris after the vigil. She also heads the Schenectady chapter of the NAACP.
So this guilty verdict means, I think, for the community of Schenectady and for the nation that justice has finally been served, but we also know it's the beginning of the work that we have to do. This is by no means the end of the work.
Nelson also spoke to Schenectady City Councilwoman Marion Porterfield, who was in attendance.
So when I heard the verdict, first of all, I cried. It was tears of relief for all that we've been through as a country, not just over this past year, but for many, many years. But to finally see justice in
We shall overcome.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that.
Meanwhile, reporter Wendy Libertor headed to downtown Saratoga Springs, where a small group of activists, mostly white, had gathered.
Garland Nelson, musician Garland Nelson, was there performing. He was actually the only Black person there. There was mostly, because Saratoga Springs is a very white community, it was a mostly gathering of white folks with the MLK Saratoga group. They were celebrating.
Let's sing that verse one more time.
Saratoga Springs has recently been mired in controversy over the city's handling of establishing state-mandated police reform policies.
One of the main sticking points was a civilian review board. Saratoga Springs police do not want any civilian oversight.
Police in all three cities did not comment on the verdict Tuesday night. The next morning, police in Albany erected a barrier between the dozen protesters still camped outside the station. Eduardo was once again on the scene. There he spoke with activist Chandler Hickenbottom, who'd been the protester injured a week earlier.
We demand that Mayor Kathy Sheehan and Chief Hawkins fulfill their duty to uphold and repeal the repeal of 50A. We demand a database be created in cooperation with the Albany CPRB. The Albany Civilian Police Review Board's purpose is to investigate the police misconduct on behalf of the police. Police should not be investigating the police.
At this point, protesters had written a letter to the mayor and the chief of police. It went unanswered. The police union president also sent a letter to city officials, saying the city was jeopardizing the safety of its officers by allowing the sit-in to continue. By Thursday afternoon, Eduardo was on the scene again. Protesters had received a tip from a public defender that police were preparing to remove them from the premises. Shortly thereafter, Police Chief Eric Hawkins confirmed it via Twitter. Quote, "For public safety purposes," he tweeted, "it is time to end this unlawful occupation," unquote. Mayor Kathy Sheehan also tweeted her support for the action. The protesters were determined to stand their ground.
They were really nervous. They were preparing to stand their ground. And, it was interesting seeing them putting on goggles. They grabbed trash bins from near the area and tried to create a barrier. They were really tense. They were really upset.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12.
Around 10 minutes later, several dozen police in tactical gear began lining up on the street.
3 police officers walk up, and one of them tells them, you have 15 minutes to leave, or, basically we'll have to remove you, potentially arrest you.
Everybody badge number down the line. Come on, send me the badge number. Everybody badge number down the line.
We need your names and your badge
Give
number.
me your
Names
fucking
and badge number.
They're slowly approaching the encampment of these protesters. There weren't that many protesters. There were only around, I want to say, a dozen. And so the police officers, slowly keep approaching, telling them to move. And protesters keep standing their ground. And then everything snaps.
Here we go.
There's yelling, there's screaming, people are running. It was really intense.
At this point, Eduardo says, police made contact with several protesters. Some were grabbed and forced to the ground violently, zip-tied. An officer smashed camping chairs with a baton as police continued to advance. As this is happening, several dozen more protesters show up on the scene. Police established a new barrier further from the station and the former encampment. State troopers and additional law enforcement from the county sheriff's office arrived.
And it's important to know that the police who were standing there forming a barrier did not have their names or badges shown. There were a couple officers who actually had tape over their names. And I think a lot of protesters, I spoke to them, and they told me that they were upset.
I asked them, why are your badges covered? Why are your names covered? If what you're doing is lawful, there is no reason for that to take place. We have trust issues.
Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Eduardo sees a lone woman walk out in front of the barrier.
Let you go, let her by. She's not a
He quickly realized that in the tense space between police and protesters stood longtime local civil rights activist Dr. Alice Green.
I'm trying to find out where they are. I'm trying to find out who's been arrested. Nobody's telling me anything.
Steve Hughes, another Times Union reporter who was on the scene at the time, was able to talk to Dr. Green after she left the front lines.
That I think is not good for this community because the people are really angry. And I hope that the police have learned something from last time they were here.
About 2 hours later, demonstrations continued peacefully. All of Us leader Jamaica Miles took to the megaphone.
Understand! You will not divide us! What you are doing is continuing to unite us!
By nightfall, Chief Eric Hawkins had held a press conference. He defended the police action earlier in the day, saying they accomplished their goal of clearing the area and creating a safe space. Police said they'd arrested 8 protesters. 2 were sent to jail and released the next morning. 1 protester had been seen taken away in an ambulance, their condition unclear. Sources told the Times Union that police had dubbed it Operation Save South Station. Into the evening, temperatures hovered near freezing. The barrier stood firm, fronted by New York State troopers. About 60 protesters remained on site. Their demands remained unchanged. That's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. Reporting for this episode came from Eduardo Medina, Paul Nelson, Rob Gavin, Wendy Libertor, Masara Makati, Steve Hughes, and Pete DeMola. Additional support came from Lori Van Buren, Lauren Stanforth, and Mike Goodwin. For more on this story, which is still unfolding, check out the Times Union Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram feeds, or head over to timesunion.com. And we'll catch you next week here on The Eagle. The Eagle is a production of the Times Union. It's produced and edited by me, Jessica Marshall, with help from the Times Union digital team and the newsroom.